Picture this. It's the early 2000s. America is riding high on military dominance. The Cold War is over. The Gulf War was a blitzkrieg. The United States Navy rules every ocean on the planet. And the brass in Washington want to keep it that way, but they want more. They want a warship so advanced, so deadly, so unstoppable, that no enemy on Earth would even dare to challenge it. They called it the future of naval warfare. They poured billions of taxpayer dollars into it. They built it, launched it, and watched it sail. And then, everything fell apart. The USS Zumwalt. 3 ships, $23 billion. And a story of ambition, greed, bureaucratic disaster, and one of the most spectacular military procurement failures in American history. To understand how America ended up spending $23 billion on 3 destroyers that can barely afford to fire their own guns, you have to go back to the 1990s. After the Cold War ended, the Navy found itself in a strange new world. The Soviet threat was gone. The big blue water battles they'd been preparing for decades weren't coming. Instead, America was fighting smaller, dirtier wars, coastal conflicts, asymmetric threats, rogue states with shore-based missiles and littoral defenses. The Navy needed something new, something that could creep close to enemy coastlines, blast targets deep inland, evade radar, and survive in contested waters. So in 1994, they launched what they called the Surface Combatant for the 21st Century program. The goal was to design a revolutionary destroyer that could replace the aging Zumwalt-class ships and give America unmatched naval firepower well into the 2000s and beyond. It was going to be stealthy. It was going to be automated. It was going to carry next-generation weapons. And it was going to transform the way the Navy fought wars. On paper, it sounded incredible. In reality, it was the beginning of one of the most expensive lessons the Pentagon ever learned. The design the Navy settled on was unlike anything ever built for the American fleet. The Zumwalt-class destroyer, officially designated DDG 1000, was a radical departure from traditional warship design. Where conventional destroyers have flared hulls that push water out of the way, the Zumwalt has what's called a tumble-home hull, an inverted bow that slices downward into the water. Naval architects hadn't used this design on large warships in over a century, and for good reason. It was considered inherently unstable in high seas. But the Navy wanted it because it dramatically reduces the ship's radar cross-section. And that was the central obsession of the entire Zumwalt program. Stealth. Engineers designed the superstructure as one massive angular composite deckhouse, eliminating the cluttered masts, antennas, and equipment that make traditional warships so easy to detect on radar. The result is a ship that, despite being longer than a football field and displacing nearly 15,000 tons, shows up on enemy radar as something roughly the size of a fishing boat. That is genuinely remarkable engineering. In fact, it might be the only genuinely remarkable thing that went right, because everything else was a disaster waiting to happen. The propulsion system the Navy chose was called Integrated Power System, or IPS. Instead of using traditional mechanical gearboxes and propeller shafts, the Zumwalt generates electricity through gas turbines and uses that electricity to power enormous electric motors driving the propellers. The advantage was supposed to be massive, generating enough surplus electrical power to run directed energy weapons, railguns, and advanced electronic systems that would require far more power than any conventional warship could provide. The Navy was thinking ahead. They were designing not just for the weapons of today, but for the weapons of tomorrow. The problem is that tomorrow's weapons never actually arrived. Let's talk about the guns. Because the guns are really where this whole story starts to come unraveled in the most painful way imaginable. The Zumwalt was designed around a weapon system called the Advanced Gun System, or AGS. 2 of them, one on the bow and one forward of the superstructure. Each one a 155mm naval gun capable of firing rocket-assisted projectiles called Long-Range Land Attack Projectiles, LRLAP for short, with a range of over 60 miles and GPS guidance accurate enough to land within 50 meters of a target. That is extraordinary capability for a naval gun. The idea was that the Zumwalt could loiter offshore and provide the kind of precision fire support that ground troops desperately need, without risking aircraft or putting Marines in harm's way unnecessarily. It was a beautiful concept. The execution was something else entirely. The LRLAP rounds cost approximately $800,000 apiece. Each single round. You read that right. Nearly $1 million per shot. For context, a Tomahawk cruise missile, a weapon that can fly over 1,000 miles and destroy a hardened target, costs about $2 million. So the Navy designed a gun that fires ammunition nearly half as expensive as its most sophisticated missile, with a fraction of the range and no warhead large enough to reliably destroy hardened targets. And it got worse, because the LRLAP program was eventually canceled entirely. The manufacturer, before anyone else systems, shut down production because there simply weren't enough guns, ordered only 3 ships total to make the supply chain economically viable. When production stopped, the existing stockpile of rounds became so rare and so expensive that the Navy announced in 2016 that the cost per round had ballooned to over $800,000. They couldn't afford to train with them. They couldn't afford to use them in combat without burning through tens of millions of dollars in a single engagement. So, they canceled the program, which left the Zumwalt-class destroyers with 2 massive, sophisticated, cutting-edge gun turrets that they cannot fire in any meaningful way. The Navy has since welded the gun mounts shut on some of the ships. $23 billion, and the main guns are glorified paperweights. But let's back up, because the gun problem is just one symptom of a much deeper disease. The real story of the Zumwalt is about what happens when the military tries to do too much, too fast, with too little real-world testing, and with contractors who have every incentive to promise the moon and deliver a crater. When the DDG-1000 program officially kicked off in the late 1990s, the original plan called for 32 ships. 32. That number would have been enough to justify the enormous development costs, spread the expense of building the supply chain across dozens of hulls, and actually transform the surface warfare fleet the way the Navy intended. At 32 ships, the Zumwalt program might have been expensive but defensible. It might have even been successful. But here's where the system broke down. As the program's cost estimates grew, and they grew fast, the Navy started reducing the planned buy. 32 became 24. 24 became 7. 7 became 3. Each time the number dropped, the per-ship costs skyrocketed because all those development expenses had to be divided among fewer hulls. And each time the per-ship costs skyrocketed, Congress got more nervous and cut the numbers further. It was a death spiral, a self-reinforcing catastrophe where every attempt to save money made the program more expensive, which triggered more cuts, which made it more expensive still. By 2009, the program had been reduced to just 3 ships. The lead ship, USS Zumwalt, designated DDG-10000. The second, USS Michael Monsoor, DDG-1001. And the third, USS Lyndon B. Johnson, DDG-1002. 3 ships to absorb the full research and development cost of what was originally supposed to be a 32-ship program. The numbers were almost comically catastrophic. Development costs alone ran to about $9.5 billion. Divided by 3 ships, that's over $3 billion per ship just in R&D before you even lay a keel, and the construction costs were brutal too. The Zumwalt itself cost about $4.5 billion to build. The second ship came in around $4 billion. The third, slightly less because some lessons had been learned, but still well over $3 billion. Add it all up, development, construction, testing, support systems, and you're looking at somewhere between $22 and $23 billion for 3 warships. For comparison, the Navy's workhorse destroyer, the Arleigh-Burke-class, costs about $2 billion per ship. You could have built 10 Arleigh-Burke destroyers for the price of 3 Zumwalt. 10 proven, combat-tested, fully armed warships versus 3 experimental platforms that can't fire their main guns. The people making these decisions weren't idiots. They weren't corrupt, or at least not most of them. They were caught in a system that rewards ambition and punishes restraint, where admirals get promoted for championing big programs and contractors get richer by promising revolutionary capability. The incentives were all wrong. Every stakeholder in the Zumwalt program had a reason to keep it going, even as the warning signs multiplied. And the warning signs were everywhere. During sea trials, USS Zumwalt suffered an engineering casualty in the Panama Canal in 2016. The ship lost power and had to be towed to a berth. Multiple technical failures plagued the early operations of the ship. The tumble-home hull design, for all its stealth advantages, does behave differently in heavy seas than conventional hulls, raising real questions about survivability in the North Atlantic or the Western Pacific in bad weather. The automation systems designed to run the ship with a smaller crew than traditional destroyers created their own vulnerabilities. And then there's the fundamental strategic question that nobody in the 1990s thought through carefully enough. The Navy designed the Zumwalt to support ground operations to lurk offshore and pound targets with precision guns. But the long-range land attack projectile needed to fill that role was canceled. Without that weapon, what exactly is the Zumwalt for? The ship has Tomahawk missiles, yes, but so does every Arleigh Burke. It has radar systems and sensors, but those can be upgraded on existing ships. The unique capability, the thing that justified the entire program, was the gun. And the gun doesn't work. Now the Navy is scrambling to find a new mission for these 3 enormously expensive ships. One idea being seriously discussed is converting the Zumwalt's AGS turret spaces to carry hypersonic missiles, the conventional prompt strike weapon that the Navy is developing. The logic is sound. The Zumwalt's massive electrical power generation system and its large hull volume make it theoretically well-suited to carry these next-generation weapons. If that conversion happens and works, the Zumwalt might yet find a legitimate role as a strike platform. But let's be honest about what that means. It means spending additional hundreds of millions of dollars per ship to rip out the gun systems and replace them with missile launchers. It means the ships won't be ready for that mission for years. And it means the original justification for the entire $23 billion program, precision land attack from naval guns, will have been completely abandoned. The Zumwalt story is not just a tale of bad engineering or contractor malfeasance. It's a story about how systems fail, about how the gap between what military planners imagine in conference rooms and what actually works in the real world can be measured in billions of dollars and years of wasted effort. It's about the tyranny of sunk costs, the way that once a program gets large enough, once enough contracts are signed, and enough jobs are created, and enough political districts have a piece of the pie, it becomes almost impossible to kill, even when everyone knows it's failing. Defense contractors understand this dynamic perfectly. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, before anyone else Systems, General Dynamics, these are not small companies run by naive people. They are sophisticated organizations with enormous lobbying operations and decades of experience navigating the Pentagon acquisition system. They know that if you spread enough work across enough congressional districts, the program becomes politically untouchable. Representatives and senators won't vote to cancel a program that employs thousands of their constituents, even if every defense analyst in Washington agrees it's a disaster. The Zumwalt program was built in Bath, Maine, at Bath Iron Works, a subsidiary of General Dynamics. It employed thousands of skilled workers. It pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into the Maine economy. Senator Susan Collins, one of the most influential members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, happens to represent Maine. Is that a coincidence? Perhaps. Is it relevant to understanding why the program survived as long as it did despite its obvious problems? You can draw your own conclusions. The Pentagon's acquisition system is broken in ways that the Zumwalt makes brutally obvious. The system is designed to evaluate programs based on their projected capabilities, what the technology is supposed to do according to the engineers and the contractors. But there's no good mechanism for continuous reality testing. for saying every year, does this program still make strategic sense, given what we've learned? The assumption is that once a program is approved and funded, it stays approved and funded unless something goes catastrophically and publicly wrong. The Zumwalt's problems accumulated slowly, quietly, over years, each individual setback seemingly manageable, each reassessment pushing the hard decisions off into the future. There's a broader lesson here about American military spending that goes well beyond any single program. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. That sounds like an insurmountable advantage, and in some ways it is. But raw spending doesn't automatically translate to capability. Money spent on the wrong things on programs that sound revolutionary in PowerPoint presentations but fail in the real world doesn't make America safer. It makes defense contractors richer and leaves the Navy with ships it doesn't quite know what to do with. China, in the meantime, has been building destroyers of its own. The Type 055, sometimes called the Zumwalt-class, is a massive, capable surface combatant that costs a fraction of what the Zumwalt cost per hull. China has launched over a dozen of them. They carry enormous numbers of missiles, have capable radar and sensor suites, and are being deployed in the South China Sea and beyond in numbers that are genuinely alarming to American naval planners. While the United States was spending $23 billion on 3 ships that can't fire their main guns, China was building a surface fleet at scale. That's the strategic cost of programs like Zumwalt that rarely gets discussed in the budget arguments. Every dollar wasted on an over-engineered, under-delivered destroyer is a dollar that didn't go to additional hulls, additional training, additional maintenance for the ships that actually work. The Navy today is struggling with readiness, ships that aren't ready to deploy, maintenance backlogs that stretch for years, a fleet that is simultaneously expensive and in some ways less capable than it should be given the resources invested. The Zumwalt program didn't cause all of those problems, but it is a symbol of how they happen. What should have been done differently? The answer, in retrospect, seems obvious, though it never does at the time. The Navy should have built a prototype, a single ship, using the new technologies, tested it rigorously for years before committing to a large production run, and been honest about which capabilities were ready for prime time and which were aspirational. The electric propulsion system works. The stealth hull design works. The integrated power generation is genuinely innovative. There was real engineering achievement in the Zumwalt program, but those achievements should have been tested and validated before the Navy bet 32 ships on them all, working together perfectly. Instead, they went all in. And when the cost spiral made 32 ships impossible, they were left with the worst of all worlds. A tiny fleet of revolutionary but half-functional ships that cost a fortune to operate, can't fulfill their original mission, and don't fit neatly into the Navy's existing operational concepts. There's a broader lesson here about American military spending that goes well beyond any single program. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. That sounds like an insurmountable advantage, and in some ways it is. But raw spending doesn't automatically translate to capability. Money spent on the wrong things on programs that sound revolutionary in PowerPoint presentations but fail in the real world doesn't make America safer. It makes defense contractors richer and leaves the Navy with ships it doesn't quite know what to do with. China, in the meantime, has been building destroyers of its own. The Type 055, sometimes called the Zumwalt-class, is a massive, capable surface combatant that costs a fraction of what the Zumwalt cost per hull. China has launched over a dozen of them. They carry enormous numbers of missiles, have capable radar and sensor suites, and are being deployed in the South China Sea and beyond in numbers that are genuinely alarming to American naval planners. While the United States was spending $23 billion on 3 ships that can't fire their main guns, China was building a surface fleet at scale. That's the strategic cost of programs like Zumwalt that rarely gets discussed in the budget arguments. Every dollar wasted on an over-engineered, under-delivered destroyer is a dollar that didn't go to additional hulls, additional training, additional maintenance for the ships that actually work. The Navy today is struggling with readiness, ships that aren't ready to deploy, maintenance backlogs that stretch for years, a fleet that is simultaneously expensive and in some ways less capable than it should be given the resources invested. The Zumwalt program didn't cause all of those problems, but it is a symbol of how they happen. What should have been done differently? The answer, in retrospect, seems obvious, though it never does at the time. The Navy should have built a prototype, a single ship, using the new technologies, tested it rigorously for years before committing to a large production run, and been honest about which capabilities were ready for prime time and which were aspirational. The electric propulsion system works. The stealth hull design works. The integrated power generation is genuinely innovative. There was real engineering achievement in the Zumwalt program, but those achievements should have been tested and validated before the Navy bet 32 ships on them all, working together perfectly. Instead, they went all in. And when the cost spiral made 32 ships impossible, they were left with the worst of all worlds. A tiny fleet of revolutionary but half-functional ships that cost a fortune to operate, can't fulfill their original mission, and don't fit neatly into the Navy's existing operational concepts. The Zumwalt will go down in history as a cautionary tale, a reminder that in military procurement, as in so many things, the enemy of good is perfect. That revolutionary ambition without realistic assessment is just expensive fantasy. That the best warship isn't always the most technologically advanced one. Sometimes it's the one you can actually afford to build, arm, and send into battle. $23 billion. 3 ships. Guns that can't fire. And a lesson the Pentagon will probably forget just in time to repeat it all over again.